Welcome back. So as we've talked about the funding landscape, the capital pipeline. We've talked about determining your capital needs based on burn rate, based on a hypothesis you're testing to de-risk your business, and based on an amount of runway that you need in order to get there. We've also talked about the 9 points of how an investor will think about approaching your startup based on the problem, the solution, the technology, the traction, the thesis, and a number of other points that we highlighted. In the fourth module, we're going to talk about building an investor pitch deck with specific focus on the market size. So as we mentioned in the last section, we talked about the 9 points that an investor is going to think about a company based on the problem, the solution that you're providing, the thesis that they've sort of framed their limited partner agreement with and how they approach the world, the timing, whether they think this is happening right now, the team, the technology, the market, the traction, and the deal. So we're going to spend a bit more time talking about the market. So as we mentioned, there's the top-down market size. So market size analysis typically includes your total addressable market, which is called the TAM, and the sizable addressable market, or the SAM. These are the specific sort of segments or subsets of the total addressable market size that you think are actually relevant to your business. So these are the top-down metrics of how we think about, framing a market size. Additionally, there's really a bottoms-up market size approach. So it's very important that you not only have the typical pie chart where you say my market is $10 billion, I believe I can take 10% of it, therefore my market size, the sizable addressable market is $1 billion. That's helpful in framing the general context that it's a big idea, but it's not helpful in telling the investor how you're actually going to get there. So what's very important as a second slide is to talk about the bottoms-up market. So how will you specifically acquire customers? What are the channels that you're thinking about going through to acquire your customers? And we're going to talk a bit about how we can think through the bottoms-up analysis. So second, what are our unit economics? So we're talking about the cost of user acquisition. We're talking about the potential number of users, what the average revenue per user could potentially be, also known as the ARPU. And how we think about retention. So how we think about keeping these customers around. And what these number of inputs really create is what we call a lifetime value, or an LTV, of a given customer. So as we think about market size, not just from the top down, not just as the total aggregate, total addressable market, and the more sizable addressable market, the SAM, as we think about the bottoms up approach, we need to think about the unit economics of the channels we're going to go through to acquire users, how many users we think we can get, how much we think we can make off each user, and then how long we think we can keep those users around. Because ultimately, investors are going to be looking at your business and thinking about this business over time as a cash flow machine. So how does this business actually generate repeat successful cash flow? And obviously there are extremes in the consumer internet world. We see many examples of, apps and businesses that achieve massive scale without ever having a revenue or monetization model. And these are perfectly fine approaches, but we just have to keep in mind and keep the context that these are really 1 in a million type ideas. And that in the back of our minds, to position for a really successful startup and outcome, we do need to be thinking about these sorts of things, about like unit economics and user acquisition. So ultimately, what's driving a successful business is that the lifetime value, the LTV, is greater than the cost of acquisition. So over time, we're making more money off each client that we acquire than we were spending to acquire those clients. In the short run, there are obviously examples that refute this. There are many examples in startups where you spend more to acquire users early on and you're running a deficit because you believe that over time you're going to be able to reduce that cost of user acquisition and increase the lifetime value, and you can ultimately get to a place where this is a repeatable model that works. Obviously, in the long run, if your cost of acquisition is always greater than your lifetime value, this business will not be successful. So in driving this formula success, there are 3 inputs that we need to think about. So one is that we could lower the cost of user acquisition. 2, we could increase the lifetime value by increasing the average revenue per user, the ARPU. 3, we could increase the lifetime value by increasing the retention, or how long we're able to keep that client around. So these are really, 3 of the main ways that we can think about augmenting this equation, where we, ultimately get to a point where the lifetime value is greater than the cost of acquisition. And as we mentioned, in the short run, it's very possible and perfectly fine if we believe that, we need to run a small deficit in acquiring a number of early users to prove traction in order to get to a stage where we, can bring down the cost of acquisition and bring up the lifetime value. But over the long run, these are the things that we need to be thinking about. So, recap of the market analysis for the investor deck. We should have 2 slides. We should think about the top-down market, so the total addressable market of the sector that we're working in, the sizable addressable market of, the specific sort of subsets of that sector that we think are actually achievable. And then this bottoms-up approach, where we're thinking about the actual, channels for user acquisition. We're thinking about the unit economics and how we're going to go about acquiring these users and what that's going to cost. We're thinking about how we're going to increase the number of users that we've got, or the N, how we're going to reduce that cost, and how we're going to drive lifetime value ultimately being greater than the cost of acquisition by either increasing retention or increasing the average revenue per user. So as homework, I want you to think about these things. I want you to think about your cost of user acquisition. I want you to think about how the channels of acquisition will change over time. And, based on these inputs of driving sort of user growth, the N, driving retention, and driving, average revenue per user, how can you think about augmenting these inputs to, over time, be able to drive a really sustainable business where you can bring down the cost of user acquisition and you can increase the lifetime value of your customer? Because ultimately, as an investor is thinking about the market, thinking about the slides that you present, they're in the back of their head going to be thinking about, in the long run, how does this company become sustainable, and how does the lifetime value of each customer or each client start to be greater than, the cost of acquisition and the cost of servicing those customers? Because ultimately, this is what's driving a successful business. Thanks. Take a breather, and we'll be back for more.